as the United States sees China making massive incursions into what had long been American areas of influence, part of the reaction is this kind of desperation, this backlash. And I think that's where a lot of this imperial tantrums are coming from Trump. We're going to kick China and Russia out of the region. Venezuela got too close to them. We're going to take Greenland. All of this is about the fact that when the United States perceives that its empire is in danger, it starts to become more aggressive. The irony, though, is that it's precisely this kind of unilateral aggression, this very arrogant posture in the world that we just do what we want. We could get away with that in the 90s when we were the only superpower into the 2000s. 9/11 created a lot of sympathy for the U.S. All of that's gone.
Happy New Year and welcome to Downstream. This is the first Downstream recording of 2026. And what a start to the year it's been. People love to say that, don't they? But it really is true. Donald Trump is seemingly serious about the annexation of Greenland. Protests are hotting up in Iran. And Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped by the US military. We have a wild 12 months ahead of us, and Novara Media is looking forward to bringing all of that to you. My guest today is perfectly placed to talk about all of these stories, particularly with an emphasis on South America and this idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's quote-unquote sphere of influence. Glenn Greenwald is a very storied, august and venerable journalist. He helped break the Edward Snowden story and, of course, helped to set up the Intercept, a really important outlet, I think, over the 2010s and 2020s. I suppose the point of our conversation today is going to rest on a very simple question. Is US empire in decline, or is it actually yet to ascend to ever greater heights? I don't know what I think. It kind of depends on the day. And is Donald Trump a one-off, or is he indicative of a geopolitical order that increasingly is coming into view and is markedly different to the world that I grew up in? Glenn Greenwald, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to Downstream.
Thrilled to be here, Aaron. Thank you for asking me to come.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And frankly, I can't think of many people better placed to talk about the conversation we're about to have, which is US foreign policy, how it often seeks to undermine democratic governments and perhaps less democratic governments around the world, but with a particular emphasis on South America. Just for people who aren't necessarily familiar with your work, which I find hard to believe in 2026, tell us a little bit about yourself and also where you're coming from today.
Sure. So I'm an American citizen. I was born in the United States, went to college and law school in the United States, practiced law in New York for about 15 years. And in 2005, I came to Brazil. Met my husband, who is Brazilian. At the time, we didn't have the option of moving together to the United States because the U.S. had a law banning recognition of same-sex couples for immigration purposes. So we stayed in Brazil together. We wanted to share our lives together. And that's when I started writing about politics, doing journalism, principally because I couldn't practice law in Brazil, but also I was ready for a big change. And I've lived in Brazil for 20 years. My husband passed away in 2023. He was a member of the Brazilian Congress. We have kids together who are Brazilian. So I'm still in Brazil. I'm in the US all the time, in the UK a lot. So my focus tends to be foreign policy, American and Brazilian politics, a lot of stuff in Europe as well.
And of course, you've broken some of the biggest stories of the 2010s.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Snowden story was the story that I think ended up getting as much attention, if not more attention internationally and globally than almost any journalism story, probably more than any other journalism story of that year. I've also done a lot of work that proved consequential investigative journalism in Brazil, including the reporting that led to the release of Lula da Silva from prison, where they had put him to make sure he couldn't run in 2018. That was the election where Brazil elected Jair Bolsonaro. He ended up being released as a result of our reporting, ran in 2022 and narrowly beat Bolsonaro. So yeah, the journalism I do tends to be in a lot of different places, wherever the sources and material take me.
So I think you're a really fascinating guy for a bunch of reasons. I view you as somebody who's progressive. I would say you're on the left. I don't know what you say these days, but you're an independent thinker. You can often be heterodox, and I think, like with the best people, Glenn, sometimes you'll say something and it makes me think. It surprises me. You're very rarely predictable. You were one of the people that said in regard to Trump that you thought and you can tell me if this is inaccurate, that his foreign policy would be actually more palatable than Biden or the Democratic establishment. Before we go into the nuts and bolts of what's happening in Venezuela and Iran and elsewhere, have recent events over the last couple of weeks, and I mean purely on the foreign policy stuff, have recent events made you reconsider that?
So to be clear, I certainly never thought Trump was some kind of pacifist. I didn't think that he was shy about using military force and military power. What really had happened was I had been mostly associated with the left wing of American politics. I started writing in 2005 at the height of the war on terror, was vehemently opposed to that about George Bush and Dick Cheney. So developed a large Democratic Party, liberal left audience. And then when I started criticizing Obama's foreign policy, that was in many ways similar to the Bush and Cheney's, despite his promise to renew it, I think that was a critique that was perceived as being from the left, and I got associated more with the left. But one of the things that happened was I began seeing that if you attach yourself to the Democratic Party with this attitude like, yeah, we're going to work within the party, we're just going to elect better Democrats, it doesn't actually change the foreign policy. The foreign policy in Washington for decades has been extremely bipartisan. I think people actually saw that when they saw Joe Biden be the one who armed and funded Israel diplomatically or protected it, deployed troops on its behalf. Obama ordered CIA dirty wars in Syria. And this is the kind of thing that I had been observing and feeling frustrated by. And so when Trump's 2016 candidacy emerged and he ran against the establishment candidate Jeb Bush, he positioned himself as vehemently opposed to neoconservatism, condemned the Iraq War, other regime change wars, and was touting this kind of isolationism or at least anti-interventionism that I think Ron Paul had laid the foundation for within the Republican Party, really kind of spurred this view on the anti-establishment right. And so I just saw an opportunity to try and get out of this Republican Democratic prison where I wanted to try and explore some of that and help that and cultivate that anti-intervention, anti-military, anti-deep state mentality that was emerging, at least more than I had ever seen before on the right. But I was never disillusioned about the fact that Donald Trump is a very unpredictable person, isn't really deeply rooted in any ideology. I always felt like my view really is that I thought the ceiling was higher in terms of what might be achieved in a Trump presidency, but I also thought the floor was lower. But I thought it was a risk we were willing to take. And I guess the one thing I would say is it is true that in his first term, he was the first American president in decades, this is just a fact, not to involve the United States in any new war, either fighting it or financing it or being on the side of it, which I think is not trivial. But I think clearly in this term, the voices that are far more bellicose, more imperialistic, more war-seeking have become much more influential than I was hoping they would be. But at the same time, it is a little nuanced because you see in Iran, he did bomb Iran, but for one night. He bombed Yemen, but stopped the bombing after a month when he saw that it wasn't working the way he was promised. And even in Venezuela, I think the assumption was we're going to take out Maduro, have a massive standard American regime change operation, implant the unpopular opposition. And it seems, at least thus far, Trump's not interested in that. He's not interested in regime change, doesn't really care if Venezuela is actually liberated or free. He just wants the oil. So we haven't had the kind of long-term quagmire type wars or regime change operations that we've had over the past 30 years. But clearly, there's the foreign policy that is prevailing in the Trump administration is one I find repellent.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting jumping off point because, there's the vibes and there's the people on X talking about, American imperium reasserting itself. There's the talk about Greenland. There's the talk about Canada. But it's mostly talk. And actually, when you look at the operation with regards to Maduro, we'll talk about that more in a moment. When you look at what Trump is saying with regards to Reza Pahlavi in Iran, for instance, it's not the identikit neocon talking points or actions or sequences that we might have expected. You're sort of implying it's quite different, although maybe not as different as some people are stating. It's quite different to that first term. Why do you think that is? Because, of course, he had John Bolton famously at the White House, close to hand in that first term. No new wars were started. And yet this time around, he's seemingly more belligerent when it comes to foreign affairs. Why is that? Is it a change of personnel? Is he looking for legacy? Has he been co-opted by the establishment to a significant extent?
It's interesting. He did have John Bolton in that first administration. He had a lot of neocons in that administration. Part of that was just he had no idea what Washington was, how it worked, never been there before. He's easily manipulated by people who flatter him. Everybody knows that. But I think he talked about John Bolton specifically. This is a crazy warmonger, but it's good to have at your side because it scares other countries about the possibility. But Bolton was really pushing regime change in Venezuela in that first term. Convinced Trump it would be easy. Trump sort of authorized some operations. He immediately saw it was a lot harder than he was led to believe, and that's what led to John Bolton's ouster. I do think it's clearly a more belligerent foreign policy. And part of it is the fact that I think it's so important to remember that between 2021, when Trump left office, and 2024, when he won the election in November, his life was basically dominated by a multi-pronged attempt to imprison him for life. And he probably would have been in prison had he not won the 2024 election. And this makes somebody quite desperate. And that desperation led to this kind of state of vulnerability where he was very easily exploited. So you had Miriam Adelson and all these hardcore Israel loyalists, but also a bunch of Silicon Valley tycoons, military industrial complex types who never really trusted Trump before. They were actually hoping Ron DeSantis would be the president. They trusted him a lot more. But once it was obvious Trump was the only choice, they all poured huge amounts of money into him. And I think they extracted a lot of promises that he was willing to give because he knew winning the election was the only way to stay out of prison. Now, that's not exonerating, but I think it is a factor, but not the only factor. I also think if you look at Trump's whole life, he venerates the attribute of strength, what he considers to be tough and strong, making people bend to your will, making them fear you, intimidating them. That's the world that he emerged from in New York real estate. I was a litigator in Manhattan while he was doing all of that, touched against some of his operations and cases. And this is, Donald Trump's reputation. He loved Roy Cohn, the close associate and the kind of enforcer of Joseph McCarthy. That was his mentor. And this is like one of the most amoral people of the 20th century who believed in fear and power and nothing else. And I think Trump is now kind of getting this sort of psychological fulfillment from showing the world that he is stronger than any other country, can bend countries to his will, and that he feels some kind of psychological benefit. Like he feels finally to be the kind of powerful, strong person that he wanted to be. I think it's very important not to downplay the psyche of human beings, including political leaders, which plays a big role. And I think that it's a combination of all those things. The fact that he's very heavily influenced by his large donors who benefit from a more aggressive foreign policy, and by the psychological benefits that just come. He when he asked the Israeli president to pardon Benjamin Netanyahu, he said the reason is because Benjamin Netanyahu was a war hero, which is usually a term that is reserved for people who actually go fight in wars. And I think Trump was clearly talking about himself as well. He sees himself as a war hero for that successful operation with Iran. And I don't think that kind of impulse should be underestimated.
You mentioned Adelson, and then you said people around Silicon Valley. I mean, who do you mean specifically? I presume Peter Thiel is one of them. But do you have other characters in mind? Because I suppose amongst the most high-profile corporate leadership in Silicon Valley, people like Zuckerberg, Bezos, particularly Zuckerberg, really. And of course, there's Musk, park him. But they kind of got in line once it appeared inevitable. Who are the people in Silicon Valley jumping on the Trump bandwagon when he was at his lowest ebb and they were thinking, hey, there's an opportunity here?
Interestingly, most of them did not jump on the Trump bandwagon when he was at his low ebb. Like I said, they didn't trust Trump. They were eager for somebody like Ron DeSantis, a very traditional Republican, kind of just standard warmonger, Bush Cheney, old school Reaganite Republican with that foreign policy. Ron DeSantis was doing things as Florida governor, like flying to Israel and signing laws that would expand hate speech laws for people in Florida and the United States. He was signing it in Israel to punish criticisms of Israel, reclassifying it as anti-Semitism. He really was trying to cultivate that group of people, those funders were largely behind him. It was only once his candidacy proved to be kind of a flop. He had no charisma. Trump was the inevitable nominee. Only then did they all migrate. And I'm talking about, obviously, Elon Musk was the biggest funder. Mary Adelson was second. He definitely placed a big bet on Trump. But it's really these kind of second tier type people in the military industrial contracts in the world of intelligence, like Palantir and Mark Andreessen, who is investor in all of these AI companies that are the future of these massive defense contracts. Trump just yesterday said he wants to increase the budget by $500 billion, which is just that increase alone is more than any other country in the world spends on their military for a year, from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And that's money is going to all go right into the coffers of all these Raytheons and General Dynamics and Boeings, but also this new version of the military industrial complex, this higher tech AI stuff, as exemplified by Palantir, but there are a lot of others. These are the kind of people who really got behind Trump. And then you have as well the fanatical Israel loyalists who always want a very aggressive, large U.S. military because they understand that benefits Israel. You look at any, I don't know of a single Israel supporter who's opposed to what Trump is doing in Venezuela, for example. They obviously want him to engineer regime change in Iran. They are big supporters of U.S. financing of the war in Ukraine. All of these things are very connected. And I think a lot of these people who Trump feels a debt of gratitude toward because of how much money they gave him, and it's not just debt of gratitude. Trump's not exactly a loyal person. He respects people who are very rich, especially when they flatter him and help him and support him. Those are the people he cares about. And these are the people who want endless wars, constant military conflict, massive military buildup. And those are the people to whom Trump is most listening.
So we've talked about interests, huge military contracts, particularly for this new range of AI companies like Palantir. We're talking about people spying long-term interests with regards to Israel. But also there are some kind of wacky things that can't really be explained through the lens, it seems, of maximizing rational interests. And the paradigmatic example here is Greenland. So for our audience here at Novara Media, what's your read on Greenland? Is Trump serious about it? Because breaking NATO, which is such a massive extension of US power into Europe, over basically a block of ice with 50,000 people on it, seems insane. Is it just a kind of meme, or is there deeper strategic thinking at work? And if there is that coming from people outside of Trump's inner circle? Or is it just, something that captures media attention?
I think most people, and I would put myself in this category, assumed it was not a particularly serious proposal when first unveiled, for the simple reason that it came out of nowhere. It's not like, during the 2024 campaign, and U.S. elections campaigns are 18 months long. So everything that the candidate is thinking generally ends up being expressed. Greenland, the idea of annexing Greenland was never once mentioned. But then again, abducting Nicolas Maduro and trying to change the government of Venezuela wasn't either, which is, I think, part of the reason why that made so little sense to so many people. So I think when Trump started talking about Greenland, it kind of seemed part and parcel of this idea of his obsession with calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Just sort of this idea that we're going to go and take things that are ours. And I think a lot of people felt like it made no sense. The reality is, and I think more people have learned about this issue, is that the Arctic has become a more strategically important location than ever. It has access to a lot of oil, a lot of minerals. China and Russia both see it as a strategic location. And I think, I don't know who it was, some foreign policy extremists convinced Trump that it's not enough to have what the U.S. has, which is guaranteed access to Greenland. We can put military bases there if we want. That the United States has to own it, that it has to actually be made part of the United States. Remember, this is at the same time Trump was talking about making Canada the 51st American state. I think that ended up being more trolling, but I think people put that in line with Greenland. So I think now it's becoming a lot more serious. I mean, certainly Denmark and the EU and NATO are taking it a lot more seriously because the signals are being sent diplomatically and at the highest levels that they are very serious about this. And I think when they saw him do Venezuela, threaten Colombia, bomb Iran, that builds up this notion that things you assume wouldn't happen under Trump very well might. And I think the other aspect of this, Aaron, that's so important is that if you go back and look in 2016 at what really first prompted this neocon hatred of Trump and distrust of Trump, but then a broader Republican establishment dislike of Trump, it was really when he started questioning the most taboo topics in American foreign policy. One of which was he kind of blurted out at one point, obviously turned out not to be what he did, but he blurted out, I think the US has been way too pro-Israel. We need to be way more even-handed with the Palestinians if we want to get a deal, which certainly was true, but you don't say that. That was one thing that raised the alarm of neocons. But really it was this constant questioning of the NATO alliance. Why do we need a NATO alliance when the whole purpose of the NATO alliance was to protect Western Europe from communist Soviet Union that no longer exists? Trump has contempt for Western Europeans. He knows that they have contempt for him. There's not a natural fit. I think Trump feels much more comfortable with the dictators and tyrants of the Persian Gulf, even more with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin than he does with, like, say, Emmanuel Macron or Germans or he seems to get along okay with Keir Starmer because Keir Starmer gave him that letter from King Charles and Trump's family comes from that area. But, I think Trump really doesn't view the Europeans as an important ally, doesn't see NATO as a crucial alliance any longer. And you can make the case that it is less important than it once was, given geopolitics. So I don't really think Trump is going to be that constrained by the prospect that it'll create tensions between the US and NATO. And just this week, Trump said, what is NATO if the US doesn't support it? I mean, it's basically a protectorate of Europe that the United States finances. That's how Trump sees NATO. I don't think that's a big impediment for him to do something like take Greenland, just the fact that NATO might be angry or it even might contaminate the relationship.
So on Maduro, there's an argument that, this is a complete break with, status quo politics. You've kidnapped, essentially. I know the BBC aren't being allowed to say that, but you've kidnapped a head of state. Yes, they were doing certain things that the State Department weren't happy with, but, it's not like Kosovo or, even arguably Serbia in the 1990s. It was a country that was under sanctions. Had those sanctions not been in place, it would be a middle-income country with some dysfunction, but, it would get on. To kidnap the head of state of that kind of country seems kind of extraordinary. But on the other hand, you have the argument, which is, no, actually, this represents a continuity with US foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. You had Noriega, who was, of course, picked up a few decades ago. You've had various people like, I think it was Aristide in Haiti, removed. This happens all the time in the Western Hemisphere. It's not really a break with precedent. Where do you stand on that? On Maduro, on the kidnapping, is that continuity or change?
It's absolute continuity. I mean, not necessarily the means by which it was done, although that too is not entirely alien to American behavior. It was more common, I guess, this brazen during the Cold War. But since the Cold War, the United States has found endless ways to interfere in all kinds of countries in Latin America, but around the world too, to at least the extent that we just did in Venezuela, if not more so. I think, Aaron, the thing that I'm finding most interesting about the discourse surrounding Venezuela is that, you do what I do, and when people do what we do, we encounter like arguments all the time that we just are so frustrated by because it's so blatantly false, the byproduct of nationalistic propaganda or whatever. And you have to develop a thick skin, and I presume you have, but one of the things that still gets to me is that there are so many Americans who really do believe and are susceptible to the government saying that the reason we're going to go to war, the reason we're going to change this government, the reason we're going to overthrow that government is because we want to liberate the people of the country. We want to bring freedom and democracy to them. And it always amazes me that Americans can watch, and this is actually true for British people as well. The British Prime Minister can go visit Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and heap praise on them and give them weapons and strengthen the UK Jordanian relationship or Egyptian relationship, all savage tyrants. We help them stay in power. The US does as well. And then the next day you can turn around and say, we want to go to war with this country because we don't like dictatorships and we want to free the people of that country. One of the things that Trump has done And it isn't really a break from policy, but it's a break in terms of the discourse. Is Trump really, for the most part, is dispensing with this pretense that the United States is motivated by bringing freedom and democracy to the world. In fact, the Trump administration just issued this national security strategy at the end of 2025, and there's this whole section in there clearly designed to justify the close U.S. relationship with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris. But it was expressed as a kind of principle that we're done caring about the kinds of governments other countries have. We're not going to lecture them that they need to have elections the way we do, that they need to be liberal democracies. That's their culture. That's their tradition. That's up to them. And all we care about is partnering with them if it advances American interests. And I do think it was so notable that when this happened with Maduro, the assumption of everybody was, okay, it's time for Maria Machado to go back or Edmundo Gonzalez to go back and run the country. And Trump immediately threw cold water on that and said, yeah, Maria Machado's a nice lady, but she doesn't have any support in Venezuela, which may be an exaggeration, but there's a lot of truth to it as well. And he made clear that they're not really interested in freeing Venezuela. That's not what this is about. It's about taking their oil. And that generally is why the U.S. does these things, but prior presidents have always pretended that it's about this kind of more noble agenda. And maybe there's some benefit in this candor that Trump is bringing, where the pretense isn't even being bothered with, and hopefully that will give Americans more clarity about what we're really doing in the world.
So you're speaking to us today from Brazil. You've got deep seated and long-standing connections with Brazil that go back decades, personal and political. What happens next in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico? Because, there are some insinuations from various people, some credible, some less so, that, a similar fate could beset Petro in Colombia, for instance, or the head of state in Mexico, or even Lula da Silva in Brazil. Now, in that final example of Brazil and indeed Mexico, I find that implausible, frankly. But how seriously is that possibility, at least, being taken by civil society in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia?
Brazil is in the process of imprisoning former President Jair Bolsonaro and many of his top allies on charges that they tried to perpetrate a coup after Bolsonaro lost the 2022 election very narrowly to Lula. And when Bolsonaro was president, it was during the Trump administration. He was often viewed as called the Trump of the tropics. Was very kind of oversimplified to the point of inaccuracy. But in any event, Trump viewed Bolsonaro as an ally. He visited Mar-a-Lago. And Trump saw Bolsonaro as kind of a quote-unquote friend to the extent Trump has them. And then at the same time, Brazil, over the last several years, largely in connection with this argument that the Bolsonaro movement is insurrectionist, that they're trying to seek a coup, has kind of cracked down on free speech in a way that has often burdened American tech companies. They banned X from Brazil for a little bit over a month. They've issued censorship orders to American companies continuously to ban various dissidents and their accounts. And there was this sense inside the State Department, the part of the State Department that hates leftism in Latin America, that Lula is turning Brazil into this aggressive, hardcore, left-wing autocracy. Trump obviously sees any attempt to imprison right-wing leaders through the prism of the fact that he believes that was done to him unjustly, that it's lawfare. And so Trump made this big showing. They imposed sanctions on the key judge who was doing it, tariffs on Brazil as punishment, and said, this is going to keep happening unless you stop this persecution of Bolsonaro and let up on the censorship regime. And Lula, being an extremely clever politician, immediately saw the opportunity. He was more defiant about this than I've ever seen a country, maybe with the exception of a huge country like China, be to the United States. Just stuck his middle finger up, picked up the banner of nationalism and said, the United States doesn't tell us how we run our country. Brazil is decided by Brazilians. And then on top of that, he went on this charm offensive with Trump. He met with Trump. I know this for a fact. He said to Trump, I'm a tough guy. I was put in prison for 18 months. I endured it. I never whined. Bolsonaro is this weak loser. He's constantly crying. He's sick. He's always going to the hospital, doing all this pity stuff. He's a kind of person that you would not respect. And Trump really started liking Lula and lifted the sanctions, lifted the tariffs, even though what the United States said they wanted, they got none of. Bolsonaro is now in prison. Most of his movement is the censorship regime has escalated. And there's reports now that President Petro called Trump, and it was actually New York Times reporters were in the Oval Office when it happened. They talked for an hour, and the reporter said it very much seemed to diffuse the possibility that Trump would do this in Colombia. And I think Mexico, the United States is working with Mexico in a very cooperative way. Trump doesn't really perceive them as his adversarial force. He might want to bomb a couple drug cartels because that was a campaign promise just to show that he did it. So I think that's the hard part about talking about a Trump foreign policy is so often it's more determined by his own idiosyncratic, petty, personal needs of flattery and rapport than it is by any actually identifiable ideology or even theory of American interests.
Yeah, you mentioned the that famous letter from Prince Charles recently that he got from Keir Starmer in the Oval Office. And I wonder...
King Charles, please don't offend the royal family.
Did I say Prince Charles?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, I'm living in the past, Glenn. Yeah, he got that letter from King Charles, and of course, then we get 10% tariffs on our cars that are being exported to the US. But it could have been 25% if there wasn't that letter, or 20% in line, I think, with the rest of Europe. And you think, God, there would have been businesses that would have gone under. People would have lost their jobs. People wouldn't have been able to feed their families if Keir Starmer hadn't handed this guy a letter from King Charles, offering a second official visit the first time that's happened. And you think, this is such a crazy way to be operating. But sticking with this, we've talked about South America, and that's really interesting. And you've provided really useful information there that I certainly wasn't aware of. Let's talk about China quickly. I think people look at the kidnap of Maduro as just, again, wow, a bolt from the blue. You've said, and I think that's right, there's context, there's continuity with what's happening in South America. But also, if you look at China, this wasn't really discussed very much, but the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, imagine the daughter of the CEO of Microsoft, or, the daughter of, Bill Gates or Elon Musk, imagine that person being arrested by a foreign entity. She was arrested in Canada, and the ambition was to get her extradited to the US and charged with offences relating to Huawei being connected to the shell company, which was building infrastructure in Iran. Anyway, that was initiated under Trump 1.0. I think her name was Meng Wanzhou, I think, Ren Zhengfei's daughter. What's the kind of approach with China? Because of course we've had the tariffs and we've had the export controls on things like microprocessors being exported. That was adopted by Biden, and actually the Democrats thought that was a really good idea. What's new with regards to China that has surprised you, or is that something that's actually going a little bit cold? Because it seems that the real animus in American foreign policy was the view of Trump, rather, was, we'll cool down on Russia, we'll cool down on other conflicts around the world because we want to focus monomaniacally on that threat coming from China, technological, political, military. But that doesn't seem to be happening now. We don't really seem to hear very much about US-China relations in the last 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Actually, this idea that we have to forget about the Middle East, even kind of lessen our focus on Europe and quote unquote pivot to China, goes back to the Obama administration. This was an aspiration of the foreign policy officials that were governing Obama's foreign policy, and it also never happened. We don't seem, interestingly, to be able to extricate ourselves from the Middle East, even though in terms of our strategic interest, it pales in comparison to other places. The Persian Gulf dictators are happy to sell their oil to us. The United States produces more oil than any other country in the world. Seems like Israel is the thing that holds us there, but there's no strategic value in Israel. It's in the middle of a desert. But this pivot to China never really happened. And one of the things is, if you listen to how the Democrats talk about China versus how Trump talks about China, by far the most antagonistic and aggressive language comes from Democrats. Remember, Nancy Pelosi actually made a point to make a state visit to Taiwan, treating it like a sovereign state. She purposely created it as though it were a separate state visit, something that was incredibly provocative to the Chinese. And The Democrats have often criticized Trump for being insufficiently confrontational with the Chinese. If you listen to how Trump talks about Xi Jinping, you will not hear a greater level of respect and admiration coming from anybody than comes from Trump when he talks about Xi Jinping, which goes back to what we were talking about at the start about how Trump most reveres force and strength and this idea that people rule with an iron fist are the people who are most admirable. I think he very much likes Xi Jinping. He has respect for him. He understands that there's no such thing as a viable hot war, a hot military confrontation with China. I seriously doubt that he would be willing to go to war in order to defend Taiwan if China really decided to invade it or to try and take it over or otherwise be aggressive about it. The one thing Trump has been preoccupied when it comes to China is the same thing he's preoccupied with other countries, which is the issue of trade and the idea that China exploits the United States for unfair trade deals. But it is interesting, the bipartisan class in Washington views China as the only meaningful threat to American hegemony in the world. And I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. If you care about American hegemony, I don't. But for people who do, they're right to see China as their main competitor, and their eyes even like an adversary or an enemy. But nothing that Trump is doing is really reflecting that. We were way more aggressive militarily in the South China Sea, all surrounding China, under the Biden administration than we haven't been in the first year under Trump. And I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of like not really even a meaningful pressure point that the United States and China are even close to any sort of tension that could even plausibly provoke military conflict. Not saying it will always be like that, but you're absolutely right that in the last year under Trump, that really has not been a possibility or even a focus.
I'm going to ask a provocative question, Glenn, because, people like us and the people we interview, we read, they say that American empire is under threat or it's in decline. There's that great argument. It was put forward by Peter Heather and John Rapley. They say in the year 2000, the West was 80% of global GDP. Today it's 60%, blah, 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 blah. There's a counter argument, which is American empire has never been stronger. If you look at the sanctions that were placed on Russia in 2022, a new sanction goes on Russian oil. All of a sudden, you've got lines of ships going through the Bosphorus, and there's like a traffic jam essentially because the State Department just a few hours earlier put a bit of regulation up on its website, and the whole world has to do stuff, blocking whole countries out of SWIFT, sanctioning this or that individual, weaponizing effectively a globalized economy. And we've talked about globalized interdependence as being about multinational companies. Increasingly, for me at least, it feels like actually we live within this incredible globalized American empire. So where do you stand on that? Is this a moment where American global imperium is in decline, or actually has it got a hell of a long way to go?
Yeah, it's an extremely interesting, important, and difficult question. Let me begin with Brazil for a second again, just because I can talk in with great clarity about it, and I think again it illustrates this dynamic. Brazil, for the last several decades has depended on the United States. The United States has been by far their biggest trading partner. It's the largest country after the United States in the hemisphere, by far the most influential in Latin America, which, as we know, the United States now sees once again as its backyard. But the issue is in Brazil, there's always been this very strong resentment toward the United States because it was the United States that helped the military junta overthrow Brazil's democratically elected government in 1964 and then imposed this 21-year, very harsh, brutal military dictatorship that only ended in 1985, re-democratized in 1989. So there are a lot of people, including Lula and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, who were very much part of that battle, have a lot of anti-American sentiment over it, but there was nowhere else for them to go. With the emergence of China, China now has become Brazil's largest trading partner. At the same time, Brazil is a founder of BRICS, along with Russia and India, South Africa, and China. And one of the things Trump perceives as very threatening to American hegemony and American empire is BRICS, this idea that there's this new emerging China-led alternative bloc. And a lot of people inside the United States foreign policy apparatus are very worried that the reason so many countries now prefer China as the superpower with whom they deal rather than the United States is because the United States goes around the world throwing its military might around the world, threatening everybody, constantly involved in wars, and China doesn't. The last time China fought a war was in 1979, which was about a 1-month border dispute with Vietnam. And, there's that famous quote from an African leader that says, when the United States comes, we get a lecture and orders. When China comes, we get a hospital and a road. And it's kind of ironic that as the United States sees China making massive incursions into what had long been American areas of influence, part of the reaction is this kind of desperation, this backlash. And I think that's where a lot of this imperial tantrums are coming from Trump. We're going to kick China and Russia out of the region. Venezuela got too close to them. We're going to take Greenland. All of this is about the fact that when the United States perceives that its empire is in danger, it starts to become more aggressive. The irony, though, is that it's precisely this kind of unilateral aggression, this very arrogant posture in the world that we just do what we want. We could get away with that in the 90s when we were the only superpower into the 2000s. 9/11 created a lot of sympathy for the U.S. All of that's gone. You now have China and a more multipolar world, but certainly a bipolar world with China, and countries have a choice. And now Lula says things all the time like, my dream every day is a dream of de-dollarization. And it's not just Lula, but Saudi Arabia and India and the Chinese wanting to get out of this system where the United States has still this great weapon that nobody else has, which is the reserve currency of the international financial system, where they can choke off entire societies like they do with Cuba, Iran, Syria. They did with Syria. They're doing with Venezuela. And I think it is this kind of paradox that as American empire becomes weaker and becomes threatened, you're going to see in the short term this much more aggressive imperial behavior, but ultimately that's just going to feed the cycle where the United States isn't going to have the ability to do that. But I don't think we're near imperial collapse. I agree with the premise of your question that the United States is still the biggest economy in the world, still has the strongest military in the world, has a deep, decade-long institutional understanding of how to bully and dominate the world. And that isn't on the verge of collapsing anytime soon.
This de-dollarization thing, I just want to stick with this for a moment because I think people hear it a lot and they don't really understand necessarily why, it's a major issue. So, of course, the United States basically sells dollars to the rest of the world because when two countries who aren't the United States want to trade with one another, let's say Brazil wants to sell agricultural products to China and, China's buying them, you want your own currency as a country, whether it's sterling in the UK or renminbi in China, but you can't have, billions of dollars of all of the world's currencies around the world. So basically everybody trades using a dollar. So it just means that domestically you have to hold your own currency and the dollar. What you're now beginning to see between, say, Brazil and China is they're saying, well, no, we'll just use our own currencies rather than mediate trade through the US dollar. And of course, this is really concerning for the State Department. I think Marco Rubio recently actually called out precisely that trade between China and Brazil. When Lula says that kind of thing, and I think you're right, that is the threat par excellence to US empire. Is that not the kind of thing that the State Department will just try and get rid of the guy for? Because ultimately it's being led by Brazil, by China. You're right, they can't touch China, but they can deal with the kind of the smaller, I wouldn't call Brazil a client state of China because it's not, but the smaller states of China, like Brazil, like Mexico, or do you think they're just simply too big to do that now?
Yeah, I mean, well, we just saw, in a way, Brazil kind of successfully push back against American attempts to dictate what has to happen inside their countries. And the weapon the U.S. used was sanctions. Just to give anyone who doesn't fully understand it, it's a complicated issue. I'm by no means the person to explain the world economic system, but there are judges on the International Criminal Court whose crime was investigating Israel for war crimes and issuing opinions adverse to Israel. There's the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who's been doing her job assigned to her by the UN of investigating war crimes in Gaza and has been very critical of Israel. And now they're under extremely rigorous sanctions. Their lives have been, extremely impeded. They can't open a bank account because banks are afraid of opening a bank account or letting them have a bank account, which would cause punishment by the United States. Can't use credit cards. They can't travel. This is the kind of thing the United States was doing to Brazilian officials. They never really enforced it. We never really got to that point. But this is the kind of power that the United States has as the holder of the reserve currency. And it is an extremely potent power. And obviously, if you're other countries, you want to find a way to undermine and subvert that. The problem is, and again, I'm not the expert in this, but everyone I've talked to and interviewed people who are experts in this, we're a long way away from anything like remotely close to what you could call de-dollarization. There were some trades, even Saudi Arabia sold oil to China and India in non-dollar currencies, circumventing the dollar system. But these are still very isolated and aberrational cases. But there's no doubt that this bloc is emerging of very powerful countries. And one of their goals is to figure out how to take the financial system out of dependency on the US dollar.
Yeah, I mean, it is really extraordinary. And of course, people purchasing these dollars for international trade is what allows the US to run these huge deficits and to spend, $1.5 trillion on quote unquote defense. And of course, it's anything but defensive. On these personal sanctions, I mean, again, this weaponization of the global economy that we're now living in is so new and so intensive. There was that film years ago, was it Enemy of the State, with Gene Hackman and Will Smith, I think, And it was this idea that the state would be able to, get your bank accounts and it could make you persona non grata. The United States can now do this with literally anybody in the world. They could do it with you. They can do it with me. And of course, like you say, the reason why the banks they will debank you is because they will get massive, massive fines. They will have to pay billions of dollars to America if they do, bank somebody like Glenn Greenwald or me or whoever else who is not on vogue with the State Department. I mean, it's really new, and these are incredibly powerful tools. When you look at what's happened to Iran in the last 10 years, it's a ratcheting up that weaponization of the global economy that I don't think people really thought was plausible 20 years ago. And it goes alongside the decline of the US. So on the one hand, yes, it's in decline as an empire, but on another, this weapon it has, I don't think any empire has ever had a weapon quite like it. It's really, really extraordinary. I want to talk about media for a minute, Glenn, if that's all right. I know it's your game.
Always happy to talk about media.
Oh, good. What do you make
Always, provided it's in a negative way. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. What do you make of the free press? Because, of course, they were bought last year for $150 million US. Who are these guys and how come they're worth so much?
The Free Press is an outlet that was founded by Bari Weiss after she very flamboyantly quit the New York Times, claiming that she was being bullied and intimidated and just harassed in all sorts of ways because of her super heterodox political opinions. I've yet to discover a single heterodox opinion that Bari Weiss holds, but that was her branding. And I've known Bari Weiss for a long time. It's interesting. When she got hired by the New York Times, she came from the Wall Street Journal, and she came with this opinion columnist named Bret Stephens, who's like an old school neocon. And most people on the left, liberals in the United States, were outraged. The New York Times had hired Bret Stephens. He's pro-life. He's a climate denialist. All these crimes that they were alleging against him. But I knew he was just standard neocon. The New York Times always has those on their opinion page. And I wrote an article saying the far more consequential hire here is Bari Weiss, because I was watching what she was doing at the Wall Street Journal. And Bari Weiss had positioned herself as this free speech champion. This was part of what the free press was steeped in. And I researched Bari Weiss's background. She spent most of her time in college, she's a fanatical Israel supporter, trying to get Arab and Muslim professors fired for the crime of criticizing Israel. She tried to ruin the reputations of anthropologists who were doing anthropological studies to try and show that Palestinians were indigenous to that land. She was anything but a free speech champion. She was the very opposite. The whole thing was a fraud. And she kind of gained some popularity because during what was called the woke excesses of like 2018 with Me Too and 2020, she was like the young, cool, hip person. Bari Weiss is gay. She's married to a woman. She's sort of like the young, hip, gay liberal who was telling boomers that their kids are all totally wrong when they're calling you racist and white supremacist. You're the ones who are right. This is a crazy ideology. So she started currying favor with a lot of billionaires. So when she left and started the free press, a lot of billionaires became very interested in investing in the free press, and they did, including people like Mark Andreessen. But it was really after October 7th when the free press turned itself into a propaganda arm of the Israeli state, denying the genocide in Gaza, denying that there was famine in Gaza, really, really dark and disgusting stuff. But that, of course, that attracts a lot of capital, a lot of support. And I think, Aaron, I don't know how much this is known in the UK, but what has happened in the US in terms of media trends is unbelievably alarming. Larry Ellison is, depending on the stock market, either the richest or second richest person on the planet after Elon Musk. Larry Ellison's only political activity, other than making money, which he's very good at, is serving and financing Israel. He's the largest single donor ever in history to the Friends of the IDF. I don't even know why it's legal for an American citizen to donate money to a foreign military, but in the case of the IDF, it is. This is a family obsessed with Israel. And at the very same time that finally public support for Israel in the U.S. is unraveling, Larry Ellison, with his son David Ellison, goes and buys CBS News and Paramount, installs Bari Weiss as the editor-in-chief of CBS News, who's also a fanatical Israel supporter as her primary cause, buys the free press for $150 million, an obscene valuation given how much money they were generating, and integrates it into CBS. But then at the same time, the most important thing is the U.S. Congress passed a law, Joe Biden signed it, big bipartisan support, to either ban TikTok or force a sale of TikTok to people that the U.S. government approves of. And they did it not because they were concerned about China, but because after October 7th, they concluded the reason young people in America were turning against Israel was because there was too much anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian content on TikTok. Namely, they were watching videos of what Israel was doing in Gaza. And they forced a sale, Donald Trump did, after it was signed by Biden, to a consortium led by Larry Ellison. And now Larry Ellison and his son are trying to buy Warner Brothers, which includes things like CNN, but also a huge other Hollywood studio. It's a massive takeover led by a family that is the richest and most pro-Israel family on the planet, consuming the most important American media outlets and putting people like Bari Weiss, who had no experience in television, never did journalism, was never a reporter, just an opinion columnist, as the head of CBS, where she's now killing stories that are adverse to the Trump administration. It is an incredibly sinister and dangerous media story that I don't think has gotten anywhere near the attention it deserves, because this is kind of a taboo topic to talk about, that pro-Israel forces in the U.S. are buying up all our media outlets.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredible. I think the company's called Paramount Skydance. You tell me if that's correct.
Yeah, Skydance was the company created by the Ellison family to buy Paramount. Yeah. And what happened was they needed the government approval. And the way they got it was that they had Donald Trump sued 60 Minutes, a CBS News program, over a completely frivolous claim, namely that they had edited a Kamala Harris video in a way that was favorable to her. Would have gotten thrown out of court in an instant, but CBS paid $15 million personally to Donald Trump, and then Trump turned around and approved the purchase of Paramount by Skydance.
Yeah, and I look at what he's doing now with the BBC, and just to be clear, the Panorama documentary on Trump was appalling, and the way that they edited his speech was misleading. But I do kind of feel that there's something similar going on here. They want to destroy the BBC. I have no love for the BBC, but I'm a big fan of public service broadcast. They want to destroy the BBC, and I think they'd like to do something similar here in this country, which is really, really terrifying for me. And quickly as well on the free press, because this might sound like, we're being, we're attacking somebody else in the media space because we're jealous or whatever. If you look at Instagram, YouTube, you look at all the various social media platforms, Novara Media, which is not big, had more people following it than the free press. And the free press gets its valuation of $150 million. Quite extraordinary. That plus the TikTok stuff, plus the stuff that Larry Ellison has, I think, committed a couple of $100 million to the Tony Blair Institute. I think so far he's given $100 million, about £75 billion. But he's committed a lot more going forward. You think there's one guy, he is on. He's got a social media network. Effectively, they're trying to buy, various U.S. news outlets. They've got increasingly maybe the most influential think tank in the English-speaking world. That's clearly the direction they take the Tony Blair Institute in. Not that influential necessarily in the US, but in the UK and actually lots of other places too around the world. It's quite frightening. And to me, this might sound cliche to some people listening and watching. This stuff doesn't happen in democracies. Giving somebody that much power in terms of media, policy, politics, it isn't normal. It hasn't been normal. And I think we're now stepping into a world where it's becoming normalized. Elon Musk being worth $700 billion plus right now while owning X. We now think that's normal, but it's not. And I'm kind of scared, Glenn, at how quickly it has become normal. We're talking really in 5 years. All of this stuff feels really, really normal. And I feel like lots of the optimism around the opportunities created by digital media for different kinds of journalism, different kinds of media are kind of evaporating a little bit. Given your experience with the Intercept and you being in this game for so long, I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot there, but I'll tell you this little anecdote first, which is, when I grew up, I didn't know any rich people, people worth $500 million, let alone billionaires. And it was really only when I started writing about politics and did journalism that I did start coming into contact with these people. And I remember after the 2008 financial crisis, I had this reader who was, he worked at a big hedge fund, made massive amounts of money, was supporting what was then just my blog. And I got to know him pretty well. And I said to him, what I don't understand is traditionally in capitalist societies, there's always been this fear on the part of the very rich that if they become too overt and brazen about not just the economic power they wield, but the political power they wield, they're going to provoke a revolution.
Yeah.
Throughout the 20th century, American oligarchs were petrified of a socialist revolution. They had their, boats off the coast with all their gold and jewels in it, and they were ready to flee at any time. And that was FDR's selling point for the New Deal was, we know you hate the New Deal, but if you don't get a New Deal, there's going to be a socialist revolution in the United States because this poverty is unsustainable. And, you had Ford and Carnegie Mellon and all these people who would drive down the streets throwing money out, trying to curry favor with the masses, charity to show that that is gone. I remember after the financial crisis when Wall Street got bailed out and millions of Americans got ejected and evicted. I asked him, what happened to that? Do they not, do the very rich not fear this anymore? And he said basically no, that there's no limit on their greed. They think they're invulnerable. And I was actually writing a book about this when someone named Edward Snowden entered my life, so I never got to. But I think basically if you have a very capitalist society and you have the kind of income wealth that you just were describing, and it's gotten way worse now, you can do one of two things. You can either kind of placate the masses by redistributing or giving them just enough comforts to make them not perceive that a revolution is worth it, right? They're not starving to death. They have a place to sleep, decent life, not great, but decent enough to quell the risks that they would have to take if they did a revolution. Or you could just take the attitude F them. I'm not going to care about them. I'm just going to build the walls of Versailles higher. I'm going to make it barbed wired. I'm going to put huge amounts. I'm going to turn the United States into a surveillance state. We're going to unleash this massive paramilitarized police force that's federally controlled so that if the masses try anything, we're going to monitor them. We're going to know about it. And if they try anything, we're going to crush it. We're going to isolate ourselves. And I think that's the path that they've chosen. And once you choose that path, we don't care anymore about how resentful they are. We don't care anymore about the perception that economic wealth has completely dominated political inequality. Then there's no limits on that greed. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I do believe, and maybe it's naive or overly optimistic, that you can only push this so far.
Yeah, I think that's what history tells us, but you're quite right. I mean, growing up, I never thought that we would have somebody in my lifetime worth $700 billion US. Right, which is what Elon Musk is. I know that's tied to the value of Tesla
and headed toward a trillion. Toward a trillion.
I never thought that. People forget SpaceX is a privately owned company. This 5G space-based internet is a privately owned. It's like Iron Man. It's like Tony Stark. And that 15 years ago that sounded outlandish, but it's now the world that we're moving into. With regards to the Intercept, Glenn, you were involved in this effort to try and create something new, something different, with different values in the American media landscape, covering different kinds of stories in different ways. On reflection, how do you feel about that? How would you do things differently? And I just say that as somebody in this game. Obviously, we've got Novara Media, and I think young people increasingly want to create their own stuff too. You know, what lessons were learned from the Intercept? And are you still optimistic about that kind of work, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a massive enthusiast and supporter of independent media. I think the emergence of independent media, largely enabled by internet technology. I mean, look what we're able to do here. You know, you're in the UK, I'm in Brazil. We're able to have like a pretty professional video program, which even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, only massive corporations could afford to do, especially in terms of reaching large numbers of people. This is, I think, an extremely positive change. The decentralization of information and opinion make it harder for power centers to control opinion and perspective and to propagandize. For me, these are all very positive things. One of the reasons why I think free internet is such an important cause. At the same time, every model of independent media has potential downsides and risks and dangers. The model that we chose, and it was really sort of the byproduct of the fact that it was like 4 months into the Snowden story, the biggest journalism story on the planet. Laura Poitras and I had more leverage than almost any journalist in the world. We could pick and choose what we wanted to do. Piero Midyar was a huge supporter of the Snowden journalism, and he came to us and said, I'll fund a new media organization that's designed to defend privacy, defend a free press. And I have he knew he wouldn't interfere in our editorial mission. And all I can tell you is that he kept his word. Like, there was never, the problem with the Intercept was never that Piero Midyar ended up using his role as financier to interfere in any way. In fact, we were constantly at war with other organizations that he was funding. He was sort of like the U.S. funding two different sides of a civil war. The issue with the Intercept was more a byproduct of what the Trump era did to people, and the idea that a lot of journalists adopted the view that with Donald Trump, the only mission that matters is no longer a journalistic one. It's just defeating Donald Trump. And to me, that turned the Intercept more into a partisan organization that I was comfortable with, which is why I ended up leaving. But that's more like specific to Trump. But in general, obviously being funded by billionaires brings the huge risk that you will have to adhere to the billionaire agenda, either because they're giving you explicit instructions, or, and this happens in corporate media and BBC, and the people who work for big corporations or billionaires know what the limits are. And you don't have to tell them what the limits are. They know what they should and can't say, what they're supposed to say. And that creates a kind of self-censorship. Then you have the model that I've also used many times in my career, that I use now actually, which is, at least in part, which is being funded by readers, being funded by viewers. This has been a long-term independent model. It's become even more popular. And I love that model. It frees you up from that danger that I just mentioned. But the other danger is severe audience capture. If you're working for your audience, if you're working for your readers that in general have an ideology or a political mission connected to a political party or a political movement, they get angry if you report things or analyze things in a way that undercuts what they want to believe or their mission. And people who have an independent media know that can directly affect your finances, your ability to make a living if you alienate your audience. So nothing is perfect. Human beings create things. It's automatically imperfect, has downsides and risks. But honestly, this is what I think more than anything, Aaron, is that you could probably, I think the easiest way to succeed in independent media in terms of making the most money is to plant your flag in connection to a candidate or a party. Like, I'm a Democrat. I hate Trump. I hate the Republicans. You're going to hear that every day, or vice versa. Or I'm a conservative. But it's not a very noble way to do journalism. I don't think you feel very good about yourself. You can make a lot of money. I think that if you develop and this is what I would give advice to anybody, if you develop trust and faith in your viewers or readers, that you are always going to give them your best effort to tell them what you believe the truth is based on the evidence that you share with them, even if they end up disagreeing or even being angry about it sometimes, you will develop a much more valuable audience. Maybe not as big, but still big and valuable because those are people who want you to do journalism or analysis with integrity, and you feel a lot better about yourself. And ultimately, I think you make more of an impact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is a lesson, I think, at Novara Media we learned the hard way with Brexit. You know, lots of people were telling their audiences that, oh, Brexit can be stopped. Wish casting, right? The thing that's going to happen is the thing that we want to happen. And of course, if you didn't do the wish casting, people would get angry at you and they would attack you. And I think actually it was precisely at that moment where people needed to be honest with their audience. So, you know, we learned that the hard way. And I think, you know, you talked about Trump and the Intercept, that moment of the first Trump presidency and what it did to the Intercept. I mean, quickly, because this isn't a question I was planning to ask, and maybe it's not interesting for you, but do you think the American left has learned lessons from how it responded to Trump 1.0?
I hope so. I think the biggest lesson that needed to be learned was that the Democratic Party, American liberalism, and even parts of the America left transformed themselves into essentially nothing other than an anti-Trump force. Trump is controlled by Russia. Trump is a fascist. Trump is this. Trump wants to ruin democracy. Trump is crazy. And even if there was truth to some or most of that, at the end of the day, you know, people who are in the United States and who live want to know what you're going to do for their lives. That's so basic to politics. And if all you have to offer them is constantly talking about Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, which I don't think most Americans wake up concerned about, you're going to become increasingly distant to the things they actually care about and be perceived as out of touch. And then on top of that, the Democratic Party aligned itself with the establishment. The corporate media was very much against Trump, so that became the Democrats were aligned with the corporate media that was hated, even with the U.S. security state, the CIA, the FBI, parts of the U.S. security state in the Pentagon became very anti-Trump. These, you know, the Liz Cheneys and the Bill Kristols, people who were, and the Democratic Party became almost like devoid of conviction or political beliefs or ideology other than we hate Trump. And that proved to be insufficient. And I think that Democrats, there's a certain prong of American liberals, and even again, some people on the left, who think now that the solution to this is to kind of pick people who have a kind of media flamboyance or charisma, like they're successful in bringing attention to themselves. But a lot of these people who are good at that don't have an ideology. They're just kind of establishment tools. And the reason Trump was successful was in part because of this kind of flamboyance and charisma that he undoubtedly possesses and this talent for drawing attention to himself. But he also had a very clear ideology. Yeah. I'm not saying it was necessarily sincere, but he told the American people, your problem is immigrants. We want to keep them out. That'll drive up your jobs. That'll, save money. Trade has been unfair to you. It's deindustrialized the Rust Belt. We're going to bring back tariffs and protectionism. These foreign wars need to end. So he had a very substantive set of convictions that he repeated over and over. And I think until the Democrats decide on who they are and what they believe in and have a willingness to alienate their own donor base and their own establishment by becoming more in touch with the new political sentiment that has emerged among younger generations, only when they do that will I say that they've learned their lesson.
Who do you think would be a good candidate? Because you're talking about people who are good at courting attention, but I mean, Mamdani's good at courting attention, but so is Gavin Newsom. I presume your critique is more on people like Gavin Newsom, or am I wrong?
Yeah, Gavin Newsom, Jasmine Crockett. I just did a segment on her. She's very pro-Israel, pro-bank, like has no left-wing or anti-establishment views at all. She's a lawyer who grew out of the crypto industry, but she's good at going on CNN and MSNBC and really using unrestrained rhetoric to talk about Trump in very aggressive ways. And I just don't think that's enough. Same with Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom has always been a centrist establishment politician. And I think what Zohran Mamdani did is rather extraordinary. And what really informed this, Aaron, was in 2016, when Bernie Sanders ran against the Clinton machine, and then you had Trump over here running against the Republican machine, you have political reporters who will tell you this. You go into places like union halls or all kinds of places, and you would say, who do you like who's running for president? People would say, my two favorite candidates are Trump and Bernie. Bernie got, even though he was a left-wing candidate, got huge amounts of independent voters, nonpartisan voters, people who he got into the political because he believed in things. He was talking about their economic life, and they believed that he was sincere about the things he was saying. And I think that ended up being Zoran Mandani's key to success as well. Now, you do need the intangibles, right? Like you do need to be likable. You need to earn trust. Those are all things that matter. You do need charisma, but you need a lot more than that. And I think Zoran has actually created a model that, even though the conventional wisdom is it can't work out aside of places like New York City, I absolutely don't believe that's true.
No, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, I saw Bernie speak in London a couple of years ago now, and you just see him speak for 20 minutes. I mean, this is, I'm sure you've seen him many, many times as somebody who's, born in America. But for me, I was like, whoa, I totally get it. This dude's in his late 70s. He's towards the end of his political career. But even in a British context where, it's not like for like with the US, he just captivated 2,000 people at the South Bank for 2 hours. And I was like, whoa, this is really extraordinary as somebody who's this capable with political rhetoric. So I totally get it. I suppose that then leads to a question, which is, who do you think would be the best Democratic candidate at the next election, and who do you think will be the Republican candidate? I know these are irritating, often pointless questions, but they have relevance in terms of, I think where people should direct their energies or their focus or who to watch. So what's your view on the two candidates that are most likely to contest that election the next time around in 2028?
I think it's much easier to talk about the Republicans in this regard. Obviously, the conventional wisdom overwhelmingly is J.D. Vance. He's young. He's a vice president. We have a tradition in American politics. The vice president ends up almost automatically becoming the candidate. That's how Joe Biden became the nominee. That's how Kamala Harris became the nominee. That's how Al Gore you on and on and on. There's just so many examples. But then on top of that, if you're young and you are somebody that is good at speaking to the base of your party, as J.D. Vance is, that is a huge advantage. And even people like Marco Rubio, probably the most likely competitor to J.D. Vance, has said if J.D. Vance runs, Marco Rubio won't. So unless something extremely unexpected happens, I do think, that I would put my money on J.D. Vance. Democrats are very, very hard to predict because it's what I was just saying before. Are they going to fall into that trap where they just kind of want somebody who seems strong? And then, Gavin Newsom is a good example of that. Very good. He's very confident. You even have these like far right figures like Nick Fuentes and others almost talking about Gavin Newsom with some sort of admiration.
Yeah.
Good looking guys, what kind of confident alpha male. And if the Democrats confine themselves to those stylistic questions, then I could easily see someone like that getting the nomination. Again, when you get into the general election and there's not a lot that you can point to that you did things for the people of California in a way that will resonate beyond that, I think the Democrats are going to run into a lot of problems if that becomes their primary fixation. I think AOC is nowhere near seasoned enough. She's not old enough. I don't think she'll be taken seriously enough as a candidate. And so Bernie's too old, obviously. Zoran's too new on the scene. Typically, people emerge that you don't expect. I'm sure there will be people who do. But clearly, the field is a lot more wide open.
Is AOC too kind of woke coded for you? I mean, you said that Mamdani isn't. Actually, the criticism is, he's this New York guy and it works there. It doesn't work in the rest of the country. You don't think that's true. But do you think that is true of AOC?
Well, there's a good contrast. Zoran was mega woke, right? I mean, and he had to be. He represented this like very left-wing DSA, Democratic Socialist America, gentrified area of Queens. He was posting things in 2020 like New York City police are racist, anti-queer. It didn't get any more woke, but when he ran for mayor, he understood that that's not what people want to hear. And one of the things that Zoran did that I think is a key to his success that I can't envision AOC doing was and no one knew Zoran at all. This caught my attention. I even wrote about it at the time. Right after the 2024 election when Trump won, there were all these neighborhoods that were swung massively in New York City from the Democratic Party to the GOP under Trump. And they were mostly non-white, working class neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods. And he went for days and stood on the street and just interviewed people. Who did you vote for? And if they voted for Trump, he's like, why? And they would all say, things like, I'm sick of sending money to Israel and Ukraine in these foreign wars. I'm sick of the preferential treatment illegal immigrants get when we don't get anything. But most of all, it was like, I just can't afford to live here. And he built his campaign around this kind of like view that people who voted for Trump aren't racist or fascist or bad people, but they have legitimate concerns that the Democrats should address. AOC is a pretty clever politician. I don't mean to diminish her, but there is still a barrier if you're a woman. We haven't elected a woman president in the United States ever. The last two who tried lost to Trump. On top of that, she is non-white, and just the way she speaks and the way she presents herself, she's not Margaret Thatcher, or the kind of female politician that can be a pioneer. And maybe as she gets older, she'll become more of that. But my concern with AOC is her trajectory is very much just becoming more an establishment, more kind of a partisan every year that passes.
Yeah, I have to admit, I think the way Mamdani kind of, it's democratic politics, right? You have to lean into the people who aren't necessarily your biggest fans. And like you say, audience capture isn't just applicable to media, it's in politics too. And if you're getting, affirmation from a small group of people, it's really tempting to kind of lean into it, but actually often you've got to move away from it, which is kind of what he did a little bit in a really, really smart way. I just want to end on a few sort of personal things, Glenn, if you don't mind me asking these. You're a dad, you've got 2 kids, right?
Yes.
2 kids. How has parenthood changed your kind of views on the future and on politics? I mean, I asked that as somebody who's got a 2-year-old daughter, so it's kind of something I think about more and more.
I mean, I don't mean to be cliche about this, but it has changed everything. Being a father was never part of my life plan. Maybe it was growing up gay in the 80s and 90s. Like that wasn't things that anyone thought was really possible. It was really my husband whose dream was to be a father, and he ultimately convinced me to want to do it. And we did it together, and my kids are amazing. I can't even believe how devoted I am to them paternally. My husband passed away in 2023, so now I'm raising them alone, which even kind of strengthened those bonds even more. And there's almost nothing that I do in terms of politics where I don't think about things from their perspective. How is this going to affect the future for the next generation? And I think if you don't have kids, you can think about that in the abstract. And obviously I'm talking to someone who has a young child, so this really well. There's something very instinctive in you that forces you to just be selflessly focused on these other people who are growing up in the world, and you really care so much about how things are going to be for them. I also think it prevents you from getting settled in your ways. Like my kids are now 18 and 16, so they have no problem coming home from school and arguing with me about some political view.
Yeah.
It's important to, as you get older, there is a tendency to kind of insulate yourself and just believe that the wisdom of your generation is the only one that mattered. And I think it's also a really good way of seeing how younger people are navigating and experiencing the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really important corrective, actually, to what you just mentioned. Oh, so speaking of which, as my daughter's screaming. We'll cut
she
this
jumped
bit
in
out.
at the perfect moment. Right when we talked about her, she wanted to be heard.
Yeah, but there was an interesting article about this actually, which is your tastes, whether it's music, literature, whatever, they get kind of stuck, frozen in time in your early 20s, and you might be in your 40s or your 50s or your 60s actually if your kids are teens or in their 20s, and that's when it gets challenged again. In a way, almost you get to re-examine your tastes and whatnot. I think that's kind of cool. I'm going to ask you some names, Glenn, and this is quick fire. It's the last question. I'm going to say some names to you, and I just want one word. Is that okay?
I'm not great at this game, but I'll do my best for you, Aaron.
Yeah, well, my daughter's
I may cheat a little with a couple of words, but I'll do my best.
Okay. Zoran Mamdani. Wait a second. Let's
okay.
Hello. So I'm going to say some names, Glenn, and then you just respond to them, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Zoran Mamdani.
Future.
Hakeem Jeffries.
Establishment hack.
David Lammy.
Repellent.
Maria Corina Machado.
Pointless.
Larry Ellison.
Sinister.
Tucker Carlson.
Interesting.
Vladimir Zelensky.
Fraudulent.
Bari Weiss.
I should have used fraudulent for her, and I wasted it on Zelensky. Zionist.
Barack Obama.
Sleek.
Glenn, we're going to leave it there. This tearaway is interfering, although she's being much better behaved now. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us for this first Downstream of 2026. Sorry for a little interruption from this urchin here.
No, that was one of the best parts. Aaron, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me. It was great talking to you.
It's great talking to you anytime, Glenn. And Happy New Year. Wishing you all the best for 2026.
For you too. Bye-bye.